Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Area Conference of Churches in cooperation with KTBC. Join us now in today's Austin Faith Dialogue.
Welcome to Austin Faith Dialogue. We have an interesting program for you today discussing a faith rooted in the very beginning of early Christianity. I'm Carl Gronberg, pastor of Gethsemane Lutheran and host for the program. With me are Father James Kenna, Mr. Paul McNiven, and Margaret Jabor. All three of my guests are members of the Orthodox faith. We welcome you to Austin Faith Dialogue. Glad that you are here with us because we have some interesting questions to ask you, and we're very interested in learning about the Orthodox faith. Father James, tell us a little bit about the history of the Orthodox faith.
Orthodoxy begins in the very early days of Christianity in the Holy Land and spread first to Antioch in Syria and then to Alexandria in Egypt, across the Mediterranean to Rome, and finally into a little village named Byzantium where Europe meets Asia, which later became known as Constantinople. As Christianity spread throughout the early world, the faith was all united, so that there was only one Christian church.
When you talk about early beginnings and early church, give me some dates. What time are you talking about when you define early Christianity?
From the days of Pentecost up to the First Ecumenical Council in the early 4th century, which was in 325.
Okay, and you would follow that type of historical chronology for the Orthodox faith?
Yes, definitely. Because we see ourselves from the very beginning of Christianity as being part of the entire church, which developed out of the Middle East, and then through the expansions in the period of persecution under the pagan Roman Empire, spread throughout the whole empire, and then the empire itself was converted to the church with the accession of Constantine as the emperor, and later becoming the first Christian emperor.
Early Christianity, excuse me, but
early fourth.
Yeah, and early Christianity had some major cities where the faith was expressed.
Yes, which I said originally. The center of the faith was Jerusalem, because that's where it all historically took place. Second to Jerusalem was Antioch, which is in Syria. Today, Antioch as a city does not exist. And the head of the church of Antioch no longer lives in Antioch. He lives in Damascus, which is a city we all know from modern times. Then the third center was Alexandria, which is the center of the church in Egypt. The fourth center was Rome, which we all know is in the west in Italy. And then Constantinople replaced Byzantium when it was made the capital of the empire after it was transferred there by Constantine.
For a person reading church history, we'd read about a split that happened in the 11th century or thereabouts. Could you talk a little bit about what happened then in 1054?
Well, you really need to understand what happened prior to then to be able to follow it. If you look at your hand is a good way to see it. The 5 churches that made up Christianity for many centuries were called the Pentarchy. Pentarchy meaning 5 churches. And the 4, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Constantinople, and Antioch, have a kinship in culture and in language which they didn't share with the Church of Rome. And that's the beginning of the separation. It's a different cultural milieu. There are also different customs, different Christian customs practiced between the 2 areas of the world and the 2 groups. And as time went on, the Eastern churches became more homogeneous and banded together, culturally and historically and linguistically. And the Latin church moved in a different direction and was very much concerned with dealing what we called in those days the pagan nations, which were our forebears of the Western European nations, which at that time were not part of the Christian empire at all. But they were not even Christians. They were heathen, as we would say. and they were Latinized, and they were converted by the Latin church, and they never had much of a contact with the Eastern churches at all. The Eastern churches moved in a different direction. So over those centuries, there was a drifting. And the drifting manifested itself finally in the separation between the four churches of the East and the Church of the West in 1054, which is called the Great Schism.
Because of the language and the cultural drifting that you referred to, does it seem like it would be a natural type of thing for that split to come in 1054? Or were there other elements that led to that?
I don't think that the cultural drift itself would have produced the rift if it wasn't for the fact that the Eastern churches saw a concept developing in the West, which in their understanding of Christianity was unhistorical. And the concept we're talking about is the development of papal supremacy. It never existed in the early church, and the Eastern churches never accepted it. And as it became more pronounced in the West, and then also there were some dogmatic, which means doctrinal, concepts, beliefs that developed in the West that never developed in the East, and they went on to drive a further wedge in. And eventually, if you looked at it from a sociological standpoint, which nobody did at that time, but I'm sure if you did, you would have seen that an imminent separation would have to come.
With the ascendancy of the papacy and that division that came in 1054, where did Orthodoxy go then in the centuries that followed?
Okay, interestingly, when you read the history books, you see that the church divided in 1054. Well, both of those terms are really not accurate, because in the East there were four churches and more developing, and in the West there was basically one major church. And when they separated, it was not equal by any means. The East was much more populous and had many more Christians than the West did. So again, it's seeing it from a Western perspective. When you see it from an Eastern perspective, you see it quite differently. Now, after the actual separation, in many places it didn't make much of a difference for a long time. There were Latin congregations, and they got along well with their neighbors. And in some places there were Eastern congregations, and they got along well with their neighbors. But what put the final topping on the cake, you might say, was when the period of the Crusades arose. In the Crusades, the Latin West took upon itself to become the liberator of the Christian shrines, which meant depopulating the area, so to speak. So as they marched from Europe to the Middle East, they moved right through the Byzantine Empire, which was the Christian empire of the East, and they destroyed everything in their path. And they added the final insult to injury is they took the capital city of Constantinople, expelled the patriarch who was the head of the Church of Constantinople, as are the other three patriarchs of the East, expelled the church from Constantinople, and then ignominiously established a Latin patriarchate in the city of Constantinople.
The Crusaders who came to liberate the Christians there expelled the leader of the Orthodox faith
from Constantinople and removed the church from Constantinople. And that was in the late, or it's the early 13th century. And that really finally dissolved any friendly relations. Now, there were some attempts at restoration. One of the greatest examples is the Council of Florence, which occurred and ran from 1443 to 1446. And that was probably the last time until the 20th century when serious theological dialogue took place between the theologians of the West and the theologians of the East, sitting down at a conference table in a very hospitable climate.
We want to talk about that dialogue of the 1960s when we come to it, but there was an immigration then.
Yes.
The people came from the old countries to the new land, to the United States, to America.
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about that immigration. Where's the strength of the Orthodox faith in North America?
Originally, Orthodoxy came at the United States, in particular, and Canada, from two directions. From the south in Florida, in the area of Tarpon Springs, which was the center of the sponge fishing industry. And naturally, the Greeks were very experienced in sponge fishing, so you got a very large Greek community developing from the Florida coast, from Tarpon Springs all the way up to New Orleans. In the far northwest, Alaska, which was not part of the United States, but part of the Imperial Russia, which we bought from Russia. In Alaska, you had a tremendous Orthodox missionary outpouring in the person of two people in particular, St. Herman of Alaska, who is the Orthodox patron of the United States, and St. Innocent, who became the first bishop of the native peoples and spent his life translating the services, the scriptures, and all Orthodox literature into the native languages of the American not the American, of the Alaskan people who were not only Eskimos, but Tlingit and Aleutian Indians.
I want you to pursue that for us in a while. We want to talk about how the Orthodox faith is reflective in the different ethnic groups.
Yes.
But Margaret, let's go to you. Let's talk a little bit about a girl who grew up here in Austin, a native Austinite, and grew up in this congregation, St. Elias. Tell us a little bit about the beginnings. I understand, was it your great-grandfather who was one of the founders of the congregation?
The great beginnings, yes, immigrated from Lebanon and Syria into the United States in the early 1900s and starting a new lifestyle here, building their businesses, learning a new language. Started in the downtown area, basically, and began to hold church services in various families' homes, and also became the main site was on 6th and Trinity, which is now Maggie Mae's.
That's great.
Held church services upstairs, which was a hardware store at the time. And around the early 1930s, 1932 to be exact, monies were finally begun to raise, and this was the beginning of the Great Depression, of course, so money was very tight. And they worked hard and raised funds up and purchased brick and roofing materials from the old Central Christian Church, which was located where our federal courthouse is now today. And all that was beginning the construction site of our church building at 408 East 11th.
So the family came from Lebanon to Austin, Texas.
To Austin, yes.
And brought with them their culture and their faith.
Exactly.
And when they came here, they wanted to have a worship experience that be reflective of what they knew at home in Lebanon. Is that right?
That's correct. To bring back what they
Would you
had
say
there.
then, Margaret, that family and faith are very important to people of the Orthodox faith?
Very much so. I mean, without the strong families, the church is the main center of it all. How can we have strong families if we don't have the church in the middle as our nucleus?
What would be, I hope I don't throw you a curve on this one,
No.
but what would be some of the rituals the family, when you were growing up,
Yes, sir.
in a family that loyal to their community, the Austin community, working in the community, but also working in their home congregation, what would be some of the rituals that your parents would have taught you and your brothers at home that were maybe an expression of the local congregation? Worship, of course, would be part of your life every Sunday, I would imagine, but what are some of the other things?
Every Sunday, of course, but I mean, church and our faith carries on through our everyday lives, through anything we do, for what we do in our businesses or any of our lifestyles. It's our center.
What about fellowship time at the church? Would food and suppers and Lebanese food be a part of that?
Well, of course it was very strong. I mean, one of the main fundraisers of our church was brought through the Lebanese foods. What better way to raise money than to bake breads, which several of the women did, and all the Lebanese pastries and go out and sell. The first site was at the old Austin National Bank building at 6th and Congress. That was the first annual food festival. And of course it's held every year. Our food festival's October of every year is held. And that was the beginning of our construction, October of '32. So this is carried on.
Well, what I'm trying to get to is that it seems to me that in a lot of healthy expressions of faith, there's that connection between culture and religion or faith. It's not something separated, but it's something that is kind of bonded together. And it seems that's true with you coming out of your background, and it certainly is true then, Father James, of the different cultural groups, ethnic groups that the Orthodox Church has made its impact upon. You talk about the Lebanese culture, you talk about the Greek culture. What are some of the others?
Russian, Bulgarian, Albanian, Serbian. There are many, many different cultures, and it's interesting. Every group of Orthodox people has its own set of cultural values. Now, the faith is the same, but the language and the culture and the customs aren't necessarily the same.
So the faith transcends the language,
Exactly.
the culture, and the traditions.
That's its uniqueness.
Uh-huh.
That's its uniqueness.
Let's hold on to that because we want to come back to that. Paul, one of the interesting things about you and your life at St. Elias is that you're involved, along with the congregation, in an event that the Austin community knows about called Theophany. And we know about it because, well, we hear about it in the news and we read about it in the paper. Tell us a little bit about what Theophany is, and then we're going to ask Father Kenneth to describe some footage that we have, some tapes. So tell us about Theophany, would you, Paul?
Theophany is God expressing himself. And he does this supremely at the celebration, since we celebrate in the water, next to the water. And the water reminds us of our own baptism, because at theophany, we also are renewed. So it's the time of the year that we can start over. And our celebration, toward the end of the liturgy, we stop, everyone runs out, gets in their cars. We take our robes and so forth and go down to the waterfront. And we have an ancient ritual in which we bless the water, give thanks. And this connects us very well together with the ideas in the feast itself. It brings it alive, and it gives everyone an opportunity to celebrate, have fellowship together, and discover something new.
When is Theophany celebrated?
January the 6th. We celebrate it the Sunday which is closest to the 6th.
The 6th.
Because,
why the 6th?
Because that is the traditional feast of the coming of the Lord and his preparing to work on our behalf. Christmas was added later as a special feast. Theophany was always the central feast, which gives rise to our beginning.
All right. Thanks, Paul. And I want Margaret come back to you then as a family-type person. When Theophany would come in your congregation when you were growing up, was that something you kids looked forward to? Was it a fun time for the family to go together and participate in the Theophany?
Very much so. I think it's changed, though. We've done it differently in the past 10 years, more so since Father James has participated in our church, where we've taken it out to Town Lake itself and have had the actual cross diving. Before it was done within the church itself. We never would go out to the lake and do it. And
so Father James kind of got you out of the building and down to the lake,
We've had a few changes there, exactly, diving into the freezing water.
That's great. Well, we have some tape, and we want to look at that. And Father James, would you give a little narration of what we see as we look at this tape that is going to be run right now?
You're looking at the waters of the lagoon in Fiesta Gardens. That's the gospel book and the processional cross as we're leaving the area and proceeding down to the water for the blessing. That's our choir who are singing the hymn of the baptism of Christ. That's the meaning of the feast. They're the divers. That's me and the crowd gathering around. There's the throwing of the cross.
The cross is thrown into
the water, and the divers dive for it. And then the one retrieving it receives a special blessing and has a position of honor within his parish, because this isn't just our parish. Orthodox people from several parishes around the area come and join together. That's the water which has been blessed. It is, some of it is poured back into the lake, and some of it is distributed among the parishioners for use in their homes, and some is taken to the church and used for the various blessings which are done in the church throughout the year.
What would they do with the water in their homes?
Oftentimes they'll drink a little of it if they don't feel well, or they'll use it to sanctify a place in their homes, to bless a book or something, or an area of the house.
Now, what were you doing there?
Okay, this is the pouring of the water back. Okay, and there goes the cross, and there go the divers.
The divers are going in after it. Somebody found it, huh?
Right.
What happens if they don't find it?
There's the dove. That's another interesting thing. We release a white dove, the symbol of the Holy Spirit.
Oh, beautiful. Well, what happens?
Some of the acolytes.
It's a wonderful ritual.
Yes, it is. It's beautiful.
And there is much of that within
There's one
the Orthodox.
of the divers warming up. That's the icon of Theophany, which we have a close-up of. You can see much more clearly. That's Bill Littau, our choir director, who's very wonderful and does a fine job for us here. And he's also an old member of the parish.
January 8th will be the
this year, on Sunday at Fiesta Gardens at noon.
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock.
Fascinating. Are the public invited to come?
Absolutely,
Definitely.
absolutely. And the actual ceremony is not very long. And when the ceremony's over, as Paul said, we gather together for fellowship, and we have food.
You go back to St. Elias?
No, we do it right at Fiesta Gardens.
Fiesta Gardens.
We have food, music, and dancing. And
What about those poor divers? They're freezing.
Well, they dry off.
Last year we started having a pageant
Yes.
of taking the scripture story of John the Baptist seeing the Lord coming and announcing his coming. And this year we're going to add a little bit more to that.
There's so
Sort of
much
a graphic representation.
richness
Yes.
in the Orthodox faith. I
Very.
want to talk about the icons, and we have some of those, and we like to look at those, and maybe,
Okay.
Father James, you'd explain to those who are watching the program about these icons
Okay.
and the place of icons within the Orthodox faith.
An icon is an image of the heavenly in the earthly. That happens to be the icon of Christ. The writing that you see inscribed on it is Greek. It says Jesus Christ. And the little letters that are in the shafts of light in the halo represent God's statement to Abraham. When Abraham questioned who he was, God said, I am who I am. And in Greek, those letters stand for the one who is. The icon of Christ is probably the most symbolic of all the icons, because the incarnation of Christ not only makes iconography possible, the Orthodox believe it makes it mandatory because Christ came into human form.
How would this icon of Christ be used in your liturgy, in your worship?
Any feast of Christ, this icon will be displayed for veneration, not worship. We don't worship icons, we only worship God. But icons are methods of veneration. For instance, if you have someone that you love and care for, I'm sure you carry their picture in your wallet. But when you look at that picture in the wallet, you don't think the picture is the person. So we don't mistake the icon for the reality that it represents. However, it gives us a focal point, and it's very much part of our faith, so that we use icons like people in the West might use pictures or stained glass windows or a hymn book or a sign of the cross or an actual cross as a symbol. No, it's not a symbol, but it's like that. It's an earthly representation of a divine reality. It breaks through the divine and brings it into the earthly realm. Icons, another very favorite phrase you'll hear is, icons are theology in color.
All right, I like that. We have another icon. Explain this one to us.
Okay, this is the Nativity. Okay, in the Orthodox view of the Nativity, Christ was born in a cave in Bethlehem that was used as a stable. So we don't have the traditional creche or nativity set. We have the icon of the Nativity. The Greek lettering on the icon says the birth of Christ. And in the icon it shows Mary lying in the cave with the child in swaddling clothes, accepting him. In the background you see the choir of the heavenly hosts proclaiming the miracle. And down, very far down in the bottom of the icon towards the right, you see St. Joseph being tempted by the devil, because the devil didn't really want him to believe that all this was happening.
That's very good and very fitting for this time of the year.
Yes.
What about then the third icon we have is that of the Theophany?
Yes.
Is that correct? Maybe we could see the close-up of the third icon.
Okay,
And
that's
this is a Theophany.
which we said, this shows you graphically that the meaning of the feast is the baptism of Christ. That's Christ standing in the Jordan River with John the Baptist, or the forerunner, to his left as you're looking at it. At this time, his divinity was manifested, as Paul said. This is when God showed himself forth. That's what theophania means in Greek, the showing forth of God. Not just the showing forth of any old thing, but the showing forth of God. And from that time on, our Lord's ministry on earth was delineated, clarified.
In the Orthodox faith, Father James, there seems to be so much emphasis upon ritual and liturgy. I want to ask Paul, what about, can you say to us, those watching, what does that ritual mean to you and your Christian faith?
It's a reenactment and a connection with the actual events that we are thinking of, and the scriptures that we're reading of the time. It makes it come alive because it connects us through time with the real situation.
And I think that's important to the Orthodox faith, with that rootedness in history, as Father James has talked about. I want to jump to the 1960s, and we talked about 1054 and the separation. Then in the 1960s, relationship with Rome and the Western Church changed, didn't they? Tell us quickly about that, if you would, Father James.
Again, I have to go back just a little bit. The Protestant Reformation had no effect on the Eastern Church whatsoever, because the Eastern Church had already, for several centuries, been separate from the West. So when the Eastern Orthodox people began to come to the New World, which is the United States and Central America and South America and Canada, they were confronted with a religious pluralism that they had never experienced in their lifetimes. And it was very strange to them. And this drove us into a very homogeneous group of communities where it was almost like a pinochle game, we and they. if you understand what I mean. We gathered together. Now, right in the midst of all this, the World Council of Churches was developed. And in the World Council of Churches, the Orthodox got together on the national church level, the different national churches, and decided that they should have a presence, and their presence should be to show the world what Christianity originally was. And it was just at that time that the Roman Church began to change and be more open and more reaching out. So our ecumenical patriarch, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople, at the time was a man, a very, very holy man by the name of Athenagoras. And he and Patriarch Benedictus of Jerusalem, the head of the Jerusalem Church, met with Pope Paul VI. And the very historic meeting that they had rescinded the ancient excommunication between the East and the Western churches, the Latin Church and the Eastern churches.
So
And that began this new rapprochement.
That which happened in 1054 was rescinded, and new relationships, healthy relationship between East and West.
Yes.
What does, Margaret, what does the church mean to you, just very quickly? If you're going to think of all the things that you've grown up with, what does it mean to you? Is it community? Is it life? What does it say to you?
Community, heritage,
Identity?
you can relate to that, and your strong faith.
Your family's given a lot to this congregation. Has the congregation given a lot to you?
Very much so, very much so.
You can intend to stay in the faith and continue to live out your life in the faith.
No plans to change whatsoever. I wouldn't know what to do without it.
That's beautiful. Paul, how about you? What does it mean to you?
It means something certain and solid now that leads to forever.
We really have many values and teachings that we share together. And we've learned so much from you, and there's so much more to learn. And I'm hoping that some of the folks who have watched the program will be able to call you, Father James, and talk to you, and Margaret maybe talk to you or Paul, and learn more about the Orthodox faith and all that you give to our community. We're thankful for you, and we appreciate you. I asked Father Kenna to give me thoughts about closing this program, and Father James said I might tell you that Orthodoxy is the best kept